Chapter 8. Miscellaneous Supernumeral Experiences. The matter in this chapter does not seem, strictly speaking, to come under the heading of any of the preceding ones. It contains no account of houses or places permanently haunted, or of warnings of impending death. Rather, we have gathered up in it a number of tales relative to the appearance of the race of living men, or accounts of visions, strange apparitions, or extraordinary experiences. Some few of these have a purpose, while the majority are strangely aimless and purposeless. Something is seen or heard, that is all. No results, good or bad, follow. We commence with one which, however, certainly indicates a purpose which was fulfilled. It is the experience of Mrs. Seymour, wife to one of the compilers. When she was a little girl, she resided in Dublin. Among members of the family was her paternal grandmother. This old lady was not as kind as she might have been to her granddaughter, and consequently the latter was somewhat afraid of her. In the process of time, the grandmother died. Mrs. Seymour, who was then about 8 years of age, had to pass the door of the room where the death occurred in order to reach her own bedroom, which was a flight higher up. Past this door the child used to fly in terror with all possible speed. On one occasion, however, as she was preparing to make the usual rush past, she distinctly felt a hand placed on her shoulder and became conscious of a voice saying, "Don't be afraid, Mary." From that day on, the child never had the least feeling of fear and always walked quietly past the door. The Reverend D.B. Knox sends a curious personal experience which was shared by him with 3 other people. He writes as follows: "Not very long ago, my wife and I were preparing to retire for the night. A niece who was in the house was in her bedroom and the door was open. The maid had just gone up to her room. All 4 of us distinctly heard the heavy step of a man walking along the corridor, apparently in the direction of the bathroom. We searched the whole house immediately, but no one was discovered. Nothing untoward happened except the death of the maid's mother about a fortnight later. It was a detached house, so that the noise could not have been made by the neighbors." The following tale, the double or wraith of a living man, was seen by 3 different people, one of whom, our correspondent, saw it through a telescope. She writes, "In May 1883, the parish of A was vacant, so Mr. G diocesan curate, used to come out to take service on Sundays. One day there were 2 funerals to be taken, one at a graveyard some distance off, the other at A churchyard. My brother was at both, the far-off one being taken first. The house we then lived in looked down toward A churchyard, which was about a quarter of a mile away. From an upper window, my sister and I saw 2 surpliced figures going out to meet the coffin, and said, 'Why, there are 2 clergy,' having supposed that there would only be Mr. D. I, being short-sighted, used a telescope, and saw the 2 surplices showing between the people. But when my brother returned, he said, 'A strange thing has happened. Mr. D. and Mr. W., curate of a neighboring parish, took the far-off funeral. I saw them both again at A, but when I went into the vestry, I only saw Mr. W. I asked where Mr. D. was, and he replied that he had left immediately after the first funeral, as he had to go to Kilkenny, and that he, Mr. W., had come on alone to take a funeral at A.' Here is a curious tale from the city of Limerick of a lady's double being seen with no consequent results. It is sent by Mr. Richard Hogan as the personal experience of his sister, Mrs. Mary Murnane. On Saturday, October 25, 1913, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Mr. Hogan left the house in order to purchase some cigarettes. A quarter of an hour afterwards, Mrs. Murnane went down the town to do some business. As she was walking down George Street, she saw a group of 4 persons standing on the pavement engaged in conversation. They were her brother, a Mr. O. S., and 2 ladies, a Mrs. P. O.D. and her sister, Mrs. M. O.D. She recognized the latter as her face was partly turned towards her, and noted that she was dressed in a knitted coat and a light blue hat, while in her left hand she held a bag or purse. The other lady's back was turned towards her. As Mrs. Murnane was in a hurry to get her business done, she determined to pass by them without being noticed. But a number of people coming in the opposite direction blocked the way, and compelled her to walk quite close to the group of 4. But they were so intent on listening to what one lady was saying that they took no notice of her. The speaker appeared to be Miss M. O.D. And though Mrs. Murnane did not actually hear her speak as she passed her, yet from their attitude the other three seemed to be listening to what she was saying, and she heard her laugh when right behind her. Not the laugh of her sister P, and the laugh was repeated after she had left the group a little behind. So far there is nothing out of the common. When Mrs. Murnane returned to her house, about half an hour later, she found her brother Richard there before her. She casually mentioned to him how she had passed him and his three companions on the pavement, to which he replied that she was quite correct except in one point, namely that there were only three in the group, as M.O.D. was not present, as she had not come to Limerick at all that day. She then described to him the exact position each one of the four occupied and the clothes worn by them, to all of which facts he assented, except as to the presence of Miss M.O.D. Mrs. Murnane adds, "That is all I can say in the matter, but most certainly the fourth person was in the group, and I both saw and heard her. She wore the same clothes I had seen on her previously, with the exception of the hat. But the following Saturday she had on the same colored hat I had seen on her the previous Saturday. When I told her about it, she was as much mystified as I was, and am. My brother stated that there was no laugh from any of the three present. Mrs. G. Kelly sends an experience of a wraith which seemed in some mysterious way to have been conjured up in her mind by the description she had heard, and then externalized. She writes, "About 4 years ago a musical friend of ours was staying in the house. He and my husband were playing and singing Dvorak's Spectre's Bride, a work which he had studied with the composer himself. This music appealed very much to both, and they were excited and enthusiastic over it. Our friend was giving many personal reminiscences of Dvorak and his method of explaining the way he wanted his work done. I was sitting by, an interested listener, for some time. On getting up at last and going into the drawing room, I was startled and somewhat frightened to find a man standing there in a shadowy part of the room. I saw him distinctly and could describe his appearance accurately. I called out and the two men ran in, but as the apparition only lasted for a second, they were too late. I described the man whom I had seen, whereupon my friend exclaimed, 'Why, that was Dvorak himself!' At that time I had never seen a picture of Dvorak, but when our friend returned to London he sent me one which I recognized as the likeness of the man whom I had seen in our drawing room. A curious vision, a case of second sight, in which a quite unimportant event previously unknown was revealed, is sent by the percipient, who is a lady well known to both the compilers and a lifelong friend of one of them. She says, "Last summer I sent a cow to the fair of Limerick, a distance of about 13 miles, and the men who took her there the day before the fair left her in a paddock for the night close to Limerick city. I woke up early the next morning, and I was fully awake when I saw, not with my ordinary eyesight, but apparently inside my head, a light, an intensely brilliant light, and in it I saw the back gate being opened by a red-haired woman and the cow I had supposed in the fair walking through the gate. I then knew that the cow must be home, and going to the yard later, I was met by the wife of the man who was in charge in a great state of excitement. 'Oh, law, miss,' she exclaimed, 'you'll be mad. Didn't Julia,' a red-haired woman, 'find the cow outside the lodge gate as she was going out at 4 o'clock to the milking?' That's my tale, perfectly true, and I would give a great deal to be able to control that light, and see more if I could." Another curious vision was seen by a lady who was also a friend of both compilers. One night she was kneeling at her bedside saying her prayers. Hers was the only bed in the room, when suddenly she felt a distinct touch on her shoulder. She turned round in the direction of the touch and saw at the end of the room a bed with a pale, indistinguishable figure laid therein, and what appeared to be a clergyman standing over it. About a week later she fell into a long and dangerous illness. An account of a dream which implied an extraordinary coincidence, if coincident it be and nothing more, was sent as follows by a correspondent, who requested that no names be published. That which I am about to relate has a peculiar interest for me, inasmuch as the central figure in it was my own grand-aunt, and moreover the principal witness, if I may use such a term, was my father. At the period during which this strange incident occurred, my father was living with his aunt and some other relatives. One morning at the breakfast table, my grand-aunt announced that she had a most peculiar dream during the previous night. My father, who was always interested in that kind of thing, took down in his notebook all the particulars concerning it. They were as follows. My grand-aunt dreamt that she was in a cemetery which she recognized as Glasnevin, And as she gazed at the memorials of the dead which lay so thick around, one stood out most conspicuously and caught her eye, for she saw clearly cut on the cold white stone an inscription bearing her own name, Claire S.D., died 14th of March, 1873, dearly loved and ever mourned, R.I.P. While to add to the peculiarity of it, the date on the stone as given above was from the day of her dream, exactly a year in advance. My grandaunt was not very nervous, and soon the dream faded from her mind. Months rolled by, and one morning at breakfast it was noticed that my grandaunt had not appeared, but as she was a very religious woman, it was thought that she had gone out to church. However, she did not appear. My father sent someone to her room to see if she were there, and as no answer was given to repeated knocking, the door was opened, and my grandaunt was found kneeling by her bedside, dead. The day of her death was March 14th, 1873, corresponding exactly to the date she had seen in her dream a 12-month before. My grandaunt was buried in Glasnevin, and on her tombstone, a white marble slab, was placed the inscription which she had read in her dream. Our correspondent has sent a photograph of the stone and its inscription. The present Archdeacon of Limerick, Venerable J. A. Hayden, LL.D., sends the following experience. In the year 1870, I was rector of the little rural parish of Chapel Russell. One autumn day the rain fell in a quiet, steady, and hopeless persistence from morning to night. Wearied at length from the gloom, and tired of reading and writing, I determined to walk to the church about half a mile away, and pass a half-hour playing the harmonium, returning for the lamplight and tea. I wrapped up, put the key of the church in my pocket, and started. Arriving at the church, I walked up the straight avenue, bordered with graves and tombs on either side, while the soft, steady rain quietly pattered on the trees. When I reached the church door, before putting the key in the lock, moved by some indefinable impulse, I stood on the doorstep, turned around, and looked back upon the path I had just trodden. My amazement may be imagined when I saw, seated on a low tubular tombstone close to the avenue, a lady with her back toward me. She was wearing a black velvet jacket or short cape with a narrow border of vivid white. Her head and luxuriant jet black hair were surmounted by a hat of the shape and make, I think, used to be called at that time a turban. It was also black velvet with a snow-white wing or feather at the right-hand side of it. It may be seen how deliberately and minutely I observed the appearance when I can thus recall it after more than 40 years. Actuated by a desire to attract the attention of the lady and induce her to look toward me, I noisily inserted the key in the lock and suddenly opened it with a rusty crack. Turning round to see the effect of my policy, the lady was gone, vanished. Not yet daunted, I hurried to the place, which was not 10 paces away, and securely searched the stone and the space all around it, but utterly in vain. There were absolutely no traces of the late presence of a human being. I may add that nothing particular or remarkable followed the singular apparition, and that I have never heard anything calculated to throw any light on the mystery. Here is a story of a ghost who knew what it wanted and got it. In the part of County Wicklow from which my people comes, writes a Miss D., there was a family who were not exactly related, but of course of the clan. Many years ago, a young daughter, aged about 20, died. Before her death, she had directed her parents to bury her in a certain graveyard, but for some reason they did not do so, and from that hour she gave them no peace. She appeared to them at all hours, especially when they went to the well for water. So distracted were they that at length got permission to exhume the remains and have them reinterred in the desired graveyard. This they did by torchlight, a weird scene truly. I can vouch for the truth of this latter portion, at all events, as some of my own relatives were present. Mr. T. J. Westrop contributes a tale of a ghost of an unusual type, i.e., one which actually did communicate matters of importance to his family. A lady who related many ghost stories to me also told me how, after her father's death, the family could not find some papers or receipts of value. One night she awoke and heard a sound which she at once recognized as the footsteps of her father, who was lame. The door creaked, and she prayed she might be able to see him. Her prayer was granted. She saw him distinctly holding a yellow parchment book tied with tape. "F, child," he said, "this is the book your mother is looking for. It is in the 3rd drawer of the cabinet near the cross door. Tell your mother to be more careful in future about business papers." continent he vanished. At once awoke her mother, in whose room she was sleeping, who was very angry and ridiculed the story. But the girl's earnestness at length impressed her. She got up, went to the old cabinet, and at once found the missing book in a third drawer. Here is another tale of an equally useful and obliging ghost. A gentleman, a relative of mine, writes a lady, often received warnings from his dead father of things that were about to happen. Beside the farm in which he lived, he had another some miles away which adjoined a large domain. Once in a great storm a fir tree was blown down in the domain and fell into his field. The wood ranger came to him and told him he might as well cut up the tree and take it away. Accordingly, next day he set out for this purpose, taking with him 2 men and a cart. He got into the field by a stile, while his men went on to a gate. As he approached the gap between the 2 fields, he saw standing in it his father as plainly as they saw him in life, and beckoning him back warningly. Unable to understand this, he still advanced, whereupon his father looked very angry, and his gestures became imperious. This induced the man to turn away, and so he sent his men home and left the tree uncut. He subsequently discovered that a plot had been laid by the wood ranger who coveted his farm and who hoped to have him dispossessed by accusing him of stealing the tree. A clergyman in the Diocese of Clogher gave a personal experience of table turning to the present Dean of St. Patrick's, who kindly sent the same to the writer. He said, "When I was a young man, I met some friends one evening, and we decided to amuse ourselves with table turning. The local dispensary was vacant at the time, so we said that if the table would work, we should ask who would be appointed as medical officer. As we sat around it, touching it with our hands, it began to knock. We said, 'Who are you?' The table spelled out the name of a bishop of the Church of Ireland. We asked, thinking that the answer was absurd, as we knew him to be alive and well, 'Are you dead?' The table answered, 'Yes.' We laughed at this and asked, 'Who will be appointed to the dispensary?' The table spelled out the name of a stranger, who was not one of the candidates, whereupon we left off, thinking that the whole thing was nonsense. The next morning I saw in the papers that the bishop in question had died that afternoon, about 2 hours before our meeting, and a few days afterwards I saw the name of the stranger as the new dispensary doctor. I got such a shock that I determined never again to have anything to do with table turning." The following extraordinary personal experience is sent by a lady, well known to the present writer, who requests all names be omitted. Whatever explanation we may give of it, the good faith of the tale is beyond doubt. 2 or 3 months after my father-in-law's death, my husband, myself, and 3 small sons lived in the west of Ireland. As my husband was a young barrister, he had to be absent from home a good deal. My boys slept in my bedroom, the eldest being about 4, the youngest of some months. A fire was kept up every night, and with a young child to look after, I was naturally awake more than once during the night. For many nights I believed I distinctly saw my father-in-law sitting by the fireplace. This happened not once or twice, but many times. He was passionately fond of his eldest grandson, who lay sleeping calmly in his cot. Being so much alone probably made me restless and uneasy, though I never felt afraid. I mentioned this strange thing to a friend who had known and liked my father-in-law, and she advised me to have his soul laid, as she termed it. Though I was a Protestant and she was a Roman Catholic, had been my father-in-law, yet I fell in with her suggestion. She told me to give a coin to the next beggar that came to the house, telling him or her to pray for the rest of Mr. So-and-so's soul. A few days later, a beggar woman and her children came to the door, to whom I gave a coin and stated my desire. To my great surprise, I learned from her manner that such requests were not unusual. Well, she went down on her knees on the steps, and prayed with apparent earnestness and devotion that his soul might find repose. Once again he appeared, and seemed to say to me, "Why did you do that, E? To come and sit here was the only comfort I had." Never again did he appear, and strange to say, after a lapse of more than 30 years, I have felt regret at my selfishness in interfering. After his death, he lay in the house awaiting burial, and I was in a house some 10 miles away. I thought that he came and told me that I would have a hard life, which turned out only too truly. When I was young and full of life, with every hope of a prosperous future. Of all the strangest beliefs to be found in Ireland is that of the black dog. It is the most widespread. There is hardly a parish in the country but could contribute some tale relative to this spectre, though the majority are short and devoid of interest. There is said to be such a dog just outside the avenue gate of Donahoe Hill Rectory, but neither of the compilers have had the good luck to see it. It may be, as some hold, that this animal was originally a cloud or nature myth. At all events, it has now descended to the level of an ordinary haunting. The most circumstantial story that we have met with relative to the black dog is that related as follows by a clergyman of the Church of Ireland, who requests us to refrain from publishing his name. In my childhood I lived in the country. My father, in addition to his professional duties, sometimes did a little farming in an amateurish sort of way. He did not keep a regular staff of laborers, and consequently when anything extra had to be done, such as hay cutting or harvesting, he used to employ day laborers to help with the work. At such times I used to enjoy being in the fields with the men, listening to their conversation. On one occasion I heard a laborer remark that he had once seen the devil. Of course I was interested and asked him to give me his experience. He said he was walking along a certain road when he came to a point where there was an entrance to a private place. The spot is well known to me. He saw a black dog sitting on the roadside. At the time he paid no attention to it, thinking it as an ordinary retriever, but after he had passed on about 200 or 300 yards, he found the dog was beside him, and then he noticed that its eyes were blood red. He stooped down and picked up some stones in order to frighten it away, but though he threw the stones at it, they did not injure it, nor did they seem to have any effect. Suddenly, after a few moments, the dog vanished from his sight. Such was the laborer's tale. After some years, during which time I had forgotten altogether about the man's story, some friends of my own bought the place at the entrance of which the apparition had been seen. When my friends went to reside there, I was a constant visitor at their house. Soon after their arrival, they began to be troubled by the appearance of a black dog. Though I never saw it myself, it appeared to many members of the family. The avenue leading to the house was a long one. It was customary for the dog to appear and accompany people for the greater portion of the way. Such an effect had this with my friends that they soon gave up the house and went to live elsewhere. This was a curious corroboration of the laborer's tale. As we have already stated in Chapter 7, a distinction must be drawn between the so-called headless coach, which pretends death, and the phantom coach, which appears to be a harmless sort of vehicle. With regard to the latter, we give two tales below, the first of which was sent by a lady whose father was a clergyman and a gold medalist of Trinity College, Dublin. Some years ago my family lived in County Down. Our house was some way out of the way of a fair-sized manufacturing town and had a short avenue which ended in a gravel sweep in front of the hall door. One winter's evening, when my father was returning from a sick call, a carriage going at a sharp pace passed him on the avenue. He hurried on, thinking it was some particular friends, but when he reached the door no carriage was to be seen, so he concluded it must have gone round to the stables. The servant who answered his ring said no visitors had been there, and he, feeling certain that the girl had made some mistake or that someone else had answered the door, came into the drawing-room to make further inquiries. No visitor had come, however, though those sitting in the drawing-room had also heard the carriage drive up. My father was most positive as to what he had seen, viz., a closed carriage with lamps lit. Let me say at once that he was a clergyman who was known throughout the whole of the north of Ireland as a most level-headed man, and yet to the day of his death he would insist that he met that carriage on our avenue. One day in July one of her servants was given leave to go home for the day. Was told she must return by a certain train. For some reason she did not come by it,